Today on Uncommon Knowledge, why money might not cure poverty.
Funding for this program is provided by the John M. OLIN Foundation.
Welcome to Uncommon Knowledge. I'm Peter Robinson. Our show today, what to do about poverty in the third world. Of the 6 billion people on the planet, only about 1 billion, mostly in North America, Europe, and East Asia, possess 80% of the globe's resources, which of course means that the remaining 5 billion must share among themselves only 20% of the globe's resources. And despite tens of billions of dollars in economic assistance over the past 3 decades, many nations in the third world are no better off. If we're so smart, if economists and policymakers have made so much progress in recent decades, why is the developing world still so poor? And what, if anything, can international development agencies such as the World Bank do to help? Joining us today, 2 guests. Douglas North is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and a holder of the Nobel Prize in Economics. James Wolfenson is president of the World Bank. From an article by economists Stephen Haber, Barry Weingast, and Douglas North, I quote, "The past 2 decades have witnessed 2 large-scale experiments to transform centrally planned economies, that of the Soviet Union and Latin America, into economies with efficient markets. The economy of the former Soviet Union collapsed in 1998. The economies of Latin America performed only somewhat better." Close quote. I put it to you, Doug North and Jim Wolfenson, that when it comes to promoting economic growth in the second or third world, we understand so little about how to do it that the World Bank and other international development agencies might as well just give up. Doug?
I sort of agree with that.
You do. I rather suspect you don't, but let's hear your answer.
I significantly disagree with that.
All right. Now let me quote you to yourself, Jim Wolfenson. Quote, "In our world of 6 billion people, 5 billion have about 20% of the global resources, while 1 billion have 80% of the global resources." Close quote. And I quote you to yourself, "By any standard of measurement, much of the world's population is still poor, with individuals subsisting on less than $2 a day." Close quote. For the layman, the most basic of all questions, why? Why do we look at the world and see such a tremendous imbalance of resources? Doug?
Because essentially the institutional structure is one that does not provide incentives for people to be more productive.
Productiveness. Jim?
I think the institutional structures are not complete in many of these countries. In that sense, I agree with Doug. But I think that we are in a moment of change in the world. We have a significant problem in the numbers that you have, which half the world living under $2 a day. But I don't think that it is a terminal problem. I think it is a problem where we can move forward.
Can I ask, it seems to me there are 2 fundamental ways in which people tend to look at the problem. Number 1, the third world is poor because in one way or another the first world exploits it, takes resources away from it. Number 2, the first world is rich because the first world simply is more productive. By and large, that 1 billion who have 80% of the resources have it because they produce roughly 80% of the resources. Of those 2 models, which better fits reality? Which best fits reality? Jim?
Well, I would say that the developing world has not been as productive significantly because of its history. It was colonialized. If you take Africa, they left Africa with 47 separate countries and 600 million people. No infrastructure, no governance. And so it takes time to rebuild it. Russia was the same, by the way.
Well, I think it's clearly just a question of productivity. You're rich because you're productive, and you're poor if you're not productive, and it's as simple as that. Mm-hmm. Now, one could argue that the rich countries may have in some ways inhibited development of the poor countries, and colonialism is an instance that Jim has just raised, and that's a correct one in the case of Africa. But what the problem is, we know the institutions and so on that make for productivity, but we don't know how to get them.
Let me give you a couple. Some case studies in wealth and poverty, beginning with Latin America. 1980s, the major countries in Latin America, the ABC countries, Argentina, Brazil, Chile, others also though, see their military juntas or dictatorships replaced by democratic governments, and hopes run high that they're going to develop healthy market economies with sustained growth to parallel the change in their governance structures. Here we are a couple of decades later, and one country, Chile, has done pretty well, and the others have not. Give us the lessons. What did Chile do right? What did Argentina and Brazil do wrong? How do we tease out enduring lessons from that experience?
Well, Chile essentially, I don't like how they got there since I'm not an enthusiast over the Pinochet dictatorship, but essentially they did put in place a set of institutions, property rights, and rules of the game that turned
Property
Chile
rights, rule of law, independent, more or less independent judiciary.
Right. And that made an immense difference. Contrast that with Argentina, and I'll give you just one story which will illustrate it. When I knew Menem very well, and when I
Carlos Menem, the former president of Argentina.
And when I went and saw him one time, he said, "Doug," he said, "I'm going to come up for re-election." I said, "You can't. It's illegal." He said, "Oh, that's all right. I'm going to just change the law." And he did. Now, as long as you can have a strong executive that doesn't like the law and therefore is going to go on and in this case restructure the Supreme Court, you made economics really a dependency on the whim of politicians, and I think that's a disaster.
So you still got fundamentally rule by a single man, strongman government rather than rules of law. Objective, transparent rules by which an economy can operate. That's the point?
That's the point.
Well, I agree with Doug very much, and our approach in all these cases now is to try and establish the institutional framework. It was not only recognized by us, but by the countries themselves in Monterey and in Johannesburg. Developing countries said we must have strengthened government in terms of the people, and there's strength of the cadre of people that govern. We must have legal and judicial systems that protect rights, and we must seek to implement those. We must have financial systems that are transparent and offer finance to the whole range of people, from microcredit through to industry. And finally, we must fight corruption, because corruption, in terms of the issue of productivity and the capacity to get these countries going, is a cancer. Now, this is not imposition from the bank or the fund. This is what the countries themselves agree. And so, in this sense, I totally agree with Doug on the need for the necessary structures in place before you can move forward.
Explain the case of Argentina. Rich resources, educated populace, and even within its history, within the past century, a rich, productive economy. What's going on there?
Well, I would personally say that the centerpiece of that is bad governance and corruption. I think the country has been poorly run and corruptly run, and that there has been a tradition in Argentina, as there have been in many countries in Latin America, that a few families and a few people around power deserve the resources and the others are not taken care of. You have the broadest, the widest gap between what the rich make and what the poor make in Latin America than almost any country in the world.
Well, I sort of agree with Jim. I think that the issue is what I would call a persistence of what I call personal exchange in the world. As long as you
explain that term, you've got me there.
Well,
personal exchange.
You have personal exchange. You have exchange, whether political or economic, based on personal knowledge and intimate knowledge of the other player.
So this is where the family rule comes in. You know people in your own family. You trust them.
To get to be a rich country, you've got to have impersonal economy. You've got to create, through the rule of law and a judicial system and a structure of property rights, a system that is independent of personal ability to be able to modify
markets that you trust.
Now, it's not that we'd succeed completely, you understand. In the United States, we're always trying to do this, but we, in effect, in the Western world, created a structure that has made it possible to have people make long-distance trade, not know the other players, engage in large-scale exchange, and that's a necessary condition.
So you trust not just... This brings us to the continent with perhaps the most persistent poverty in the world. I'll quote Hoover, Weingast, and North once again. Quote, most African countries, this is almost unbelievable, most African countries are poorer today than they were in 1980. Of the continent's 36 countries, only 2, Botswana and Uganda, have managed to grow at rates exceeding 3% a year since 1980. 2/3 of African countries have either stagnated or shrunk in real per capita terms since the onset of independence in the 1960s. How come? What is the special case of Africa?
Well, Africa, I think the colonial heritage is certainly a part of the story.
But wait a minute. They're poorer now than they were when England
Wait a
and
minute,
France... All right.
The colonial heritage only means that you didn't put in place a set of institutions that would have encouraged growth. You left them in a vacuum, in effect.
I see.
And having left them in a vacuum and without the kind of human capital of knowledge, what's happened is tribal dominations and so on have produced all the worst kinds of institutions which inhibit economic growth, encourage
strongman rule, tribal rule.
Right. And the result is that where the World Bank's given money, and it gave some money to African countries earlier on, it gave them to governments, say it ended up mostly in Swiss bank accounts in Europe. It didn't do any good to the countries themselves.
Well, I think certainly the colonial history is damaging. Just to give you an idea, the other day I was with the president of Mozambique. He told me that when the Portuguese left Mozambique, they didn't have a train driver, they didn't have a taxi driver, they didn't have a crane driver. They had no one who had any form of experience. They were running their trains with the guys who had previously shoveled the coal in because they had seen what the train driver did. So when you're talking about leaving these countries without institutions, they left them almost barren in terms of people. So they've had to build this up. And the second thing was, in terms of Africa, that until the end of the Cold War, it was a pawn in the Cold War. And the United States and Russia and other countries were looking at Africa not as a development institution, but as a political chessboard. And that led to huge transfers of funds without any checks, without any balances, which was stolen by people at the time. And it's only really since the oncome of independence in a number of these countries that there's, first of all, unfortunately, a number of the people that were elected were not that great either. But we're now gradually seeing an emergence in the last 10, 15 years of African leadership that is more of a type that I think is likely to succeed.
Special case, South Africa. You have in the British and Dutch white business establishment, there you have human capital about how to run a modern economy. You have a respect for and experience with impartial institutions, impersonal institutions, and so forth. You also have apartheid. Comes the revolution, and the white leadership is subjugated or overthrown. You have in place black leadership. How is South Africa doing? Is the new black leadership grasping the importance of the institutions?
I think personally that they have continued that tradition.
So it's in pretty good shape.
I think institutionally they're in good shape. The change that is coming is the move to have more black Africans in positions of importance and in the private sector. There is a growing black African entrepreneurial class, but you cannot...
So they're working their way up rather than by fiat.
There is no question, but there is still a significant difference between the old white South African companies in terms of their existing power and the newly emerging black companies. What is happening in South Africa is a lot of expectations of pace at which the change is likely to come about. And Thabo Mbeki, the president who took over from Nelson Mandela, is in a situation where the language is very positive in terms of the change, but the pace is not as fast as it should be.
Are you generally optimistic about sub-Saharan Africa?
No.
You're not.
They are a long ways from being able to get a viable political economic system. Now, the beginning of development is you've got to create a polity, a political system that will put in place and enforce rules of the game that will make it viable. And in most of sub-Saharan Africa, that doesn't exist. And creating order and then creating from order a political system that will provide the stability and the conditions is a long ways from being realizable at this point.
I think that you could easily make that case, and I have...
His pessimistic case.
I know, but I think that the one thing that you have to say in the interests of sub-Saharan Africa is that the Africans are now trying to take a much more active role with peer review in relation to the NEPAD agreement. You have a dozen countries that are now showing each other what they're doing against yardsticks on corruption in terms of governance. There is a recognition of exactly the institutional frame that Doug was expressing. And you have to remember that it's a relatively few number of years. So I don't think you can expect a miracle overnight, but the numbers of young Africans that are getting educated, the tone of the young Africans. I have 1,000 Africans working for me in the bank, and these are remarkable young people, many of whom are going back to their countries.
And they're well educated.
Well educated, even at Stanford.
So they've gotten. We come now to the effectiveness of the World Bank itself. The World Bank, special agency of the United Nations, established in 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference. In its earliest years, makes loans to Europe for reconstruction after the Second World War, but certainly beginning by the late 1960s, most loans go to the Third World countries. Let me quote to you from a study by the Heritage Foundation. Quote, of the 66 countries receiving money from the World Bank for more than a quarter of a century, 37 are no better off today than they were before, close quote. And the countries that have made advances owe their progress to factors other than World Bank loans. Your institution has proven largely irrelevant.
Let me just quote to you Japan, Malaysia, Indonesia, Thailand, Singapore, China, India, just for openers, in terms of countries that have improved their situation in the last period that they're covering. There may be in numbers Central African Republic and other countries, and there are some larger middle-sized countries that have done less well than others. But the statistics show that standard of living has gone up, that the anticipated lifespan has gone up 20 years in the last 50 years, that infant mortality and maternal mortality is down. I'm not by any means sanguine as to where we are now. I am very worried as to where we are now. But to say that the institutions of the World Bank and other development institutions have had a negative or limited impact is just not right.
The nub of the argument against the World Bank and the IMF would run as follows, I think. That for much of their history, and indeed, according to some would argue, even today, they give money in the wrong places. That despite the best intentions, they're giving money to tin pot dictators who flip it over to banks in Switzerland, or at a minimum, they fail to create incentives for lasting institutional changes and reform. So the question I put to you is, do you grant that argument for part of the World Bank's history, but you've made or do you reject the argument out of hand? How do you grapple with that argument?
I think if you take the last 10 years, the statement is nonsense.
Nonsense.
Because I have been there. I have seen the weight that we put into legal and judicial reform. I've seen what we're doing on institutional building, exactly as Doug North described. I've seen that we understand these arguments, that there isn't a Washington consensus which is imposed. If you go back beyond 10 years, I am certain that there are examples of misperceptions and misapplication of rules. And I'm also certain that in the period of the Cold War, our institution was to some degree used as a political instrument by the United States. And I don't think you can deny that.
You grant all that?
I think certainly the World Bank has changed dramatically in the last 10 or 15 years, and for the better. I still think that if you ask yourself the tough question, and I think the World Bank has done its own study on this, which is how successful has been the bank in improving the rate of growth of economies. The answer generally is that the rate of growth of economies has been something that if it's already growing, then the World Bank's addition to it is okay. But if it's not growing, the World Bank funds have not done a thing.
How would you, so then, how would Douglas North reform the World Bank? We'll swap jobs for a moment. You're president of the World Bank. What reforms would you make, Doug?
Well, I think then this is a tough one. We do not know enough about the process of economic change, but you've got to inculcate and put in place institutions that provide incentives for people to be productive. And that's a lot harder to do than just sitting here talking about it. It's more than the rule of law. You got to have a rule of law that works, which means you got to have norms of behavior in addition to formal rules that put in place make it so that people do those things. That's very hard.
Let me suggest a minimal argument for the existence of the World Bank to see what you make of it. It can make, and in the last decade or decade and a half has been making, very useful experiments. You try to prompt institutions this way, and then you try that way. Do you buy that argument? Has it been doing a good job of that?
Doing that. I'm not sure it's been terribly successful at it. But certainly I'm much more pleased with what the World Bank's doing now than I was 10, 15 years ago.
Well, that's marvelous. Am I taking the role as an economist?
Well, actually, I'd like to. What reforms would you still like to make at your institution?
I'd like to continue what we're doing, which is to try and bring together private sector, public sector, civil society. I think if you're talking about incentives and job creation, you must engage the private sector to a greater degree, particularly in small and medium-sized enterprise, of which we're putting a great deal of effort now, because the big provider of jobs is in fact small and medium-sized enterprise, as distinct from international investments. You need to create that environment, which is dependent significantly on what Doug said, which is the structure, property rights, contract rights, and so on. We are seeking to do this. We're seeking to strengthen the capacity in these countries. And the most important thing is that you should be there to assist these countries whenever they need the assistance, which is most of the time, to try and put together an integrated approach. With the last thing that I would say is that the big change that we're making now is to try and move from what I call feel-good projects, smaller scale projects, where we've had a good experience, or some cases where we've had a bad experience, but where you've had a good experience, to scale them up. All of us, bank included, and every other development institution I know, comes to you with a list of their successes. 10 schools here, 50 kilometers of highway there, 3 hospitals here, when the need is not 10 schools, but 1,000 schools, or the need is not 50 kilometers, but 5,000 kilometers. And so what we're looking at now is how you can scale up the effective ways in which you have of developing, which involves you in a longer period of time in different management issues. This issue of scaling up is, I think, the cutting edge that I think we need to be looking at, and that requires consistency in terms of policy and support.
Government of the Final topic: is the United States doing enough to help developing nations? President George W. Bush's most recent budget calls for, in development and humanitarian aid, about $10 billion. Too big? Too small? Irrelevant?
Irrelevant. I think it's important. Well, the key is how it's used. I mean, if you're going to use it for ways that, given the way we've talked, would improve productivity and work in the ways that Jim was talking about.
You find him impressive. Are you warming to the World Bank listening to his president?
He loses his job as an economist.
Thank you. No, I mean, I think that makes sense, the things he's been saying. I'm not sure that the bank has done that, as much of that as I'd like, but I think that the bank is fumbling around on something we don't know how to create economic development. I've spent the last 20 years actually getting my hands there, or playing God, as I say, around the world. And we are just beginning to learn, what it takes.
Enough? $10 billion in humanitarian and economic aid from the United States?
I think not enough. I think that the world is spending something around $50 billion on development, of which, by the way, only half goes in cash. The rest is for consultants and various other things. We're spending $350 billion a year on agricultural subsidies and tariff protections.
In this country?
Globally. And we're spending close to $1,000 billion a year on military expenditure. And it strikes me that if you're trying to deal with the question of stability, to spend 1/20th of what you have for development, for making people's lives better, that you spend on military expenditure, is a form of nonsense that needs to be arrested.
But I agree for once.
You do?
Yeah, I like that.
You do?
Yeah, I think.
But you just said there's no real correlation. We don't know how to spend the money.
Even though we don't know, if we're concerned with trying to find out, we're going to do better than we have.
Okay, so you're content then with the use of this money as experimental?
It's not experimental.
Well, I mean, but from the economist's point of view, Doug has said several times now, we don't know how to build these institutions, but you think it's worthwhile spending the money to keep trying?
While spending, if that's what we're going to do. Too much of it historically, as Jim said, is gone.
Let me explain in one particular thing. The world has agreed that all kids have a right to go to primary school. It was done in the Declaration of Human Rights. It was done at the Millennial Summit. There isn't a leader in the world that wouldn't say that if you want to have development and peace, you've got to give every primary school kid a chance to go to school. We have 125 million kids in the world out of school. We have to raise $3 billion a year to get those countries to a level that need additional funding to put them into school. So far, we've managed to raise $300 million for 3 years. $300 million for 3 years. And this is not an issue that anyone is arguing about the objective. We know how to educate kids in school. We know what about teachers, we know about schools, we know about the curricula. Now here is a perfectly simple, straightforward example that every American would say in his heart, all kids should go to school. We cannot raise that money.
Okay. It's television, gentlemen, so I have to wrap it up. We said at the beginning, of the world, quoting you, of the world's 6 billion people, 5 billion share just 20% of the world's resources. In 2 decades, what will that proportion be? The poorest 4/5 of the world will share what proportion of the world's resources?
I don't think it'll be much more.
You don't think it will be much more?
I think it'll be a bit more because there'll be 7 billion out of 8 people on the world in 2 decades' time. 7 billion in developing countries, the same billion plus 50 million in the rich countries. And we estimate that by 2050, that number may be between 35 and 40. So it's going up if you talk about a 3.5% average growth. But the real question
going
is...
up relative to the rich world.
Yes, but if you have 7 billion out of 8 in developing countries in the year 2030, which is a reasonably conservative estimate, we need not just to be looking at today, we need to be looking at what is likely to come down the line. And if we do not have hope for those people, you're not going to have global stability.
Douglas North, James Wolfenson, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'm Peter Robinson for Uncommon Knowledge. Thank you for joining us.
Funding for this program was provided by the John M. Olin Foundation.
We are PBS.